In 1939, writer Bill Parker and artist C.C. Beck were tasked by Roscoe Kent Fawcett, the son of Captain Billy Fawcett of Captain Billy's Whiz Bang.
Is he starting to memorize jokes from Captain Billy's Whiz Bang?
To come up with a Superman-like character for Fawcett's new line of comics. The character they came up with, Captain Marvel, exceeded all expectations, not only eventually outselling Superman himself, but also introducing a new word to the American lexicon.
Shazam! 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 Shazam!
Now we're in a golden age of comic book movies, and there is a recent movie starring Shazam, the modern age reinterpretation of that original character. But that's not what I'm here to talk about today. I'm here to talk about The Adventures of Captain Marvel, a movie serial from 1941 that was the very first time a comic book superhero was brought to the big screen, beating the Fleischer Superman cartoons by about 6 months. And because it was the first one, it's fascinating to look back and see what later comic book adaptations would keep and refine from Captain Marvel's example, and perhaps even more interestingly, what they would choose not to repeat. I'm Tony Frazier, author, blogger, near genius, and this is Hero Go Home Presents Shazam, the first movie superhero. So if you're unfamiliar with the original Captain Marvel, here's a quick recap of his origin. In contrast to Superman, who was an alien sent to Earth as an infant, Captain Marvel got his powers from magic. In a city that is apparently Depression-era New York, but never named as such, young orphan Billy Batson follows a mysterious stranger into the subway, where he rides a strange subway car to a magical cave. There, he meets the wizard Shazam, whose name is derived from Greek and Roman gods and heroes, plus one biblical character, because why not? Shazam says Billy has been chosen to become the successor to Shazam's magical powers as his champion in the fight against evil. All Billy has to do is speak the wizard's name. Shazam! And he will transform into Captain Marvel. Part fairy tale, part super adventure, part comedy, with seemingly simple but surprisingly sophisticated art and writing from people like Pete Costanza, Mac Rayboy, and Otto Binder. The Marvel family books were ahead of their time, predating the Superman and Batman families of characters by over a decade. And as I said at one point, the Marvel family books were outselling the Superman books for a while, which might seem inconceivable to a modern audience which has barely ever heard of this guy. If you want to learn more about the background of the original Captain Marvel and other Captain Marvels, you can look at this video I made a couple of years ago. Apologies for the video quality, I was using an old camera back then. So as big as Captain Marvel was in the comic book world, it kind of makes sense that he would be the first to make it to the big screen. Although, actually, Republic, the studio that made the serial, originally wanted to do Superman, but Paramount had Superman's rights tied up, so they went to Captain Marvel for their second choice. And understand that I'm being very specific about the term comic book superhero, because characters like Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers from newspaper comic strips had already made it to the big screen by this time. So imagine it's 1941 and you want to bring a superhero to the big screen. What format do you use for that? And that's actually a significant question, because the theater-going experience in the 1940s was very different from what we're used to today. You did not buy a ticket for one movie, walk into a quiet theater, and wait for your movie to begin. Theaters ran programs that would last for hours. You usually had 2 features, one the main attraction with the big stars and the big budget, and the other a cheaper picture with lesser stars, if any stars at all. If you think of those pictures as A and B, you'll understand where the concept B-movie came from. Before and between these features were a variety of shorter films. Newsreels, documentaries, comedy shorts, musical shorts, cartoons, and serials, also known as chapter plays or cliffhangers. If you think of all these formats in isolation, it becomes obvious which one was perfect for adapting comic books. The cartoon. Animation was the perfect medium to depict superpowers, and given the episodic nature of Golden Age comic books at the time, where stories usually only ran 8 to 12 pages, an 8-minute cartoon length was ideal. You could even animate in an art style approximating the look of the comic. And this may be why the Fleischer Superman cartoons of the 1940s are so revered today. But those Fleischer cartoons also illustrate why no one else ever followed their example. The Fleischer Superman cartoons were insanely expensive. The story goes that when Paramount first came to Max Fleischer and told him they wanted to make a series of Superman cartoons, he wanted nothing to do with it. But because he couldn't just say no, Paramount owned the studio after all, he decided to quote a price so high that they would have no choice but to turn him down. The price he reportedly quoted was $100,000 an episode, which was an insane budget for cartoons at the time. And unfortunately for him, but fortunately for all of us, Paramount agreed to it. But Superman was the exception that proves the rule. No other comic book character was remotely big enough to commit a budget that size for what was essentially kid stuff. So comic book characters, like comic strip characters before them, ended up at the bottom of the budget barrel. The serials. Serials were generally short, 15 to 20 minutes long, full of action, and as the name Cliffhangers implies, they would usually end on some kind of life-threatening, high-stakes note, which would be resolved in the next chapter. And they often featured outrageous villains who wore costumes to disguise their identities, which sounds tailor-made for comic book adaptation. Also, serials were already being used to bring the two main predecessors of comic books, pulp magazines and newspaper comic strips, to life. So it's perfect, right? Except not. As I said above, Golden Age comic book stories were short, usually just a few pages, and designed for kids. Extended casts of supporting characters were almost non-existent. There might be a sidekick, occasionally a love interest, but beyond that, nothing to build an extended story around. A typical Golden Age story usually consisted of introducing a villain with an evil plan, having hero learn of said evil plan, having maybe one or two setbacks along the way to foiling said evil plan, usually with a new superpower he suddenly discovered. The end. That's it. But although serial chapters only ran 15 to 20 minutes each, they were part of an extended story of usually 12 to 15 episodes. So in essence, they were stories that ran 3 to 5 hours long, which made them exactly the wrong vehicle for comic book adaptation. In adapting comic book characters, the serial makers did pretty much what you would expect. They wrote exactly the same kind of pulpy two-fisted adventures they were already doing, they just slapped a cheap comic book costume on them. Almost every aspect of the original comic book stories was ignored, which is how Batman became a government secret agent fighting Japanese saboteurs, and Captain America became a crusading district attorney by the name of Grant Gardner. This is particularly ironic in the case of Captain Marvel, because it was one of the first comics to build the kind of continuity and extended cast that would be ideal for a longer story length. And in fact, Captain Marvel was also a pioneer in telling multi-issue stories. But Captain Marvel's brand of magical, whimsical adventure for kids, one of his best friends was a walking, talking humanoid tiger named Talkie Tawny, for God's sake, was exactly the opposite of the kind of hard-boiled, two-fisted adventure that the serials specialized in. So when the time came, the serial makers stuck to what they knew. And it worked like gangbusters. Even if they retained almost nothing of the original comics except the costume and the magic word, what they did come up with is now regarded as one of the best serials of all time. So let's look at the first chapter of the serial to see how they approached adapting this. And right off the bat, we see one element that they did keep from the original comics. Since Captain Marvel was a knockoff of Superman, his alter ego, Billy Batson, was also a reporter like Clark Kent, except that instead of working at a stodgy old newspaper, Billy Batson worked in the modern-age medium of radio. Billy is older in the serial than in the comics, played by Frank Coughlin Jr., who had gotten his start as a child actor, appearing in many films, including some early Shirley Temple shorts. Billy is on assignment to exotic Siam, where he's accompanying an archaeological expedition. The expedition comes under attack by natives who look more Afghan than Siamese, since Siam is now known as Thailand, for God's sake. But this is adventure movie geography from the 30s and 40s, where South Pacific Islanders look like this. So The natives are upset that the archaeologists are seeking to disturb the forbidden tomb of the Scorpion dynasty, but the expedition's guide convinces them to hold off their attack until the gods show their displeasure by causing the volcano to erupt. Later, the expedition finally enters the tomb, where they find the seal of the Scorpion dynasty. They break through it to find another identical seal, but this one warns of dire consequences if they should enter the tomb. And even though there are some fairly obvious signs that this is a bad idea, they go right in. Inside, they find a golden scorpion idol with posable arms and lenses clutched in its claws. They line up some of the lenses with a shaft of sunlight coming in, and boom! There's a mighty explosion, and the explorers are trapped inside the chamber for the rest of time. Or they would be, except Billy decided to heed the warning, and instead of entering the chamber, he went off to another room, where he encounters an old man who says he is the wizard Shazam. He has used his mighty powers to protect the secret of the Scorpion for ages, and now wants to pass his powers on to Billy. Now this is very close to the comic book origin, only instead of having to use his powers to protect all of mankind from the 7 deadly sins, this Shazam has a much narrower mandate. They never explain how a guy who derives his name from Greek, Roman, and biblical figures ends up protecting a tomb in Siam, but whatever. Billy speaks the magic word,
Shazam!
and transforms into Captain Marvel in a really nice adaptation of the comic book costume. Captain Marvel is played by Western star Tom Tyler, who was practically a special effect himself. Check out this scene later in the serial where he lifts Kenny Duncan right over his head. It does not look like they used a wire rig for this. Captain Marvel frees the expedition members and then transforms back into Billy before they can emerge. The expedition deciphers a scroll found with the Scorpion to discover that not only can one combination of lenses have tremendous destructive power, but another configuration can transmute things into gold. They decide it is too powerful to be trusted to any one man, so they distribute the lenses amongst themselves and give the scroll to Billy for safekeeping because he's the only one who can't read it. That night, natives secretly enter the camp, led by a hooded man known as the Scorpion. In a nicely subtle touch, as soon as the Scorpion steals the scroll from a sleeping Billy, the volcano erupts. The gods are angry. Now, I won't recap the rest of the serial here because you can probably figure out how it goes. The Scorpion kills the members of the expedition one by one, stealing their lenses for himself, while Billy and his friends try to discover the villain's identity. There's lots of fighting action, including stuff you might not expect from a comic book adaptation, like where Captain Marvel grabs this machine gun and starts mowing guys down, or this one where he just straight up murders a guy by throwing him off a 6-story building.
Huh? Trying to unload a Buick on me with a Chevy engine, huh? Try recalling this! Whoa! Ah, you sadistic bastard! You crushed my skull!
Other characters get in on the action as well. I don't know what it is about butlers, but in both this serial and Batman and Robin, the second Batman serial, anonymous butlers to rich victims turn into ferocious fighting machines second only to the heroes in their ability to take on multiple attackers in protracted fights. This set gets completely destroyed in a butler fight. And as the term cliffhanger implies, every chapter ends on some kind of peril, though these are not always your usual cliffhangers. Normally a cliffhanger resolves with the character shown to escape danger at the last moment, usually by inserting new footage that shows the hero escaping at the last second.
But I didn't cheer. I stood right up and started shouting, "This isn't what happened last week! Have you all got amnesia? They just cheated us! This isn't fair! He didn't get out of the cock-a-doodie car!"
But for instance, the guillotine trap at the end of Chapter 2 works perfectly. Captain Marvel doesn't escape. He's just so tough the blade breaks against his chest. Even stranger is the cliffhanger at the end of Chapter 8, where none of the main heroes get caught in the death trap. Instead, it's 2 bad guy henchmen who end up getting apparently blown up by this car bomb, and what do you know, at the beginning of the next chapter, they're dead. Weird. But of course, the real measure of a superhero adaptation is the superpowers themselves. And even with the limited technology and even more limited budget of the serials at the time, the special effects in this one are pretty impressive. The effects were by a pair of brothers named Howard and Theodore Lydecker, who were experts at delivering high-quality effects on very limited budgets, from serials in the 1930s all the way to TV shows like Lost in Space in the 1960s. They made top-notch miniatures. They used simple gags like special props to mimic super strength, which is pretty run-of-the-mill. There's an effect at the end of Chapter 5, though, that I still can't figure out. The Scorpion uses the lenses to melt the rock of a cliff face, attempting to drown Captain Marvel in hot lava, resulting in this amazing melting effect. My best guess is that they painted this cave mouth on glass and used a heat gun to melt the paint, but I really don't know. All I know is it looks amazing, and I don't think I've ever seen anyone else use this technique. Of course, the gold standard of superhero special effects is flying, and here the Lydeckers set the standard for other superhero films to follow. For instance, the Adventures of Superman TV series basically uses the same sequence of effects that the Lydeckers used. The actor performs a leap into the air, often off of a springboard. Cut to a profile of the hero in front of stock flying footage, actor drops to the ground. Early episodes of Superman would use wires for takeoffs until an accident led them to discontinue it in favor of a springboard, just like Captain Marvel. The big difference with Captain Marvel here is stuntman Dave Sharp, who performed amazing leaps for his takeoffs. Also, the filmmakers would slow down the footage of Captain Marvel landing to try to make it look more like controlled flight rather than simply dropping to the ground, although I don't think it works very well, so I'm not surprised nobody else continued this practice. For flying profile shots, the Lydeckers hung Tom Tyler in front of a rear projection screen and superimposed smoke going past him to create the illusion of motion. Although this looked much more natural than a blue screen image, it unfortunately often left the wires visible, which blue screens don't. Until the emergence of computer graphic imagery in movies, this was the template that pretty much everybody used for flying scenes, from the cheapest shit show like Puma Man to the most up-to-date expensive productions like Superman the movie, which used an advanced combination of blue screens and motion-controlled front projection. The biggest exceptions to the rule were usually laughable, like the two Columbia serials starring Superman in the late 1940s, where they used cartoon animation to simulate flight. This gave Superman really dynamic flight paths, but they break your suspension of disbelief instantly. Captain Marvel did it first, and better. And if you're at all familiar with the serial, you've probably already hit the comments to tell me what a big dummy I am, because I haven't mentioned the big dummy. The one element of the flying scenes the Lydeckers used that nobody else did was a full-size dummy sliding down a wire. They first invented the effect for a 1936 serial titled Darkest Africa to depict flying Batmen from a lost civilization, and this was 3 years before the comic book Batman debuted. Now, this may not sound that impressive, especially given that the opening credits of the serial use possibly the worst shot they could, the one where the dummy is most obviously a dummy flying in front of an almost featureless sky. But in the serial itself, the effect is amazing. Captain Marvel flies across gorges and up to the roofs of buildings, and it looks seamless because it is all literally in the same shot. The first shot that really made me gasp when I rewatched the serial as an adult was this shot from Chapter 3. Real road, real truck, real guy flying in perspective past the camera as it pans to follow him, which you would never see with a blue screen shot. And there are others later. Captain Marvel chasing a guy across a dam in a freaking tracking shot, chasing this guy across an estate, and here chasing a horse, again in perspective. Nobody else did this kind of thing, and nobody else got this kind of result. The flying effects in Superman the movie are more dynamic, but I don't think they look as natural. And CGI effects often find their way into the uncanny valley. The one movie that I think really nails its flying effects, even better than the original Captain Marvel, at least in parts, is X-Men First Class, where they used actors suspended from wires underneath helicopters to allow for the same kind of spontaneous camera movement and natural lighting to really sell the illusion. And that movie came out in 2011 and cost $160 million to make. The Adventures of Captain Marvel cost 0.1% of that, and it was over an hour longer. Even accounting for inflation, it doesn't compare. The one exception I haven't mentioned is the Rocket Man flying suit featured in serials like King of the Rocket Men and Zombies of the Stratosphere, as well as the TV series Commando Cody, Sky Marshal of the Universe, and incidentally, the inspiration for the Rocketeer.
The Rocket who?
And all of those were also done by the Lydecker brothers using the same technique. Only here they used a character with a helmet, so you couldn't tell it was a dummy when they held the shot long enough to get a good look at his face. But even that isn't perhaps the most impressive effect here. There's another effect that's so realistic and so natural that I've never seen anyone ever take notice of it. And I've never seen anyone try to imitate it, although probably for good reason. That effect is bullet hits. One of the simplest effects to pull off in a superhero movie is having a bulletproof character. You just have the actor stand impassively while people fire blanks at him. It's obvious no bullets are actually hitting him, but you could say that the bullets are just moving too fast to be seen. Most superhero films and shows use this technique for years until budgets got higher to allow for things like rigging explosive squibs under clothing or computer animation to simulate skin dimpling or bullets crumpling in extreme slow motion. The rare exceptions, like the Superman serials again, used some kind of cartoon animation that just looked silly. But in The Adventures of Captain Marvel, they sold the illusion of people shooting him by, well, actually shooting him. Look at this. We see something actually hit his chest in a little puff of smoke or dust, and it leaves a mark on his tunic. In some shots, you can actually catch a glimpse of the thing bouncing off his chest. Given the white mark it leaves behind, I'm guessing it was a piece of chalk or something. They used the same technique to simulate bullet hits on a car in the Captain America serial, also made by Republic. If you look closely, you can see the protective plate Tom Tyler is wearing under his tunic. Now, it's no surprise that nobody else does this anymore, given the risk of injury to the star if a shot should go astray and hit him in the eye, say. But the effect looks really cool. So here are what I think are the interesting takeaways. Number one, despite modern fanboys demanding fidelity to the source material, The Adventures of Captain Marvel is revered far beyond, say, Batman and Robin or Superman vs. Atom Man, even though Captain Marvel bears far less relation to the source material. Plus, I think it's amazing how hard they worked to really sell their effects by including small details. The smoke in the flying scenes, the slow-motion landings, the big dummy, the bullet hits. So much of the history of superhero films in the years since seems to have been a case of seeing how little they could get away with to still sell the illusion, at least until the advent of big-budget mass audience pictures like Superman in 1978. For all that it looks primitive now, The Adventures of Captain Marvel was more realistic and more convincing than most of the superhero adaptations that would follow for almost 40 years because they didn't know just how little they could get away with yet. And I find that fascinating. And that's it from me. If you have comments or questions, please leave them in the comment section below. Like and subscribe and hit the bell for notifications in case I ever make another video. If you have ideas for episodes or questions you want answered or topics that you want explored, hit me up. I have a website, herogohome.com. It hasn't been updated in a long time, but there are many old articles about comic books and comic book movies that you might enjoy. My email, tonyfrazier@herogohome.com, and my Twitter is @TonyFrazier1. I also have a Patreon if you'd like to see more videos like this and help contribute to making them. I'm sorry for the long wait for this video, but I had my identity stolen, and dealing with the fallout of that has taken a lot of attention for the past few weeks. Anyway, until next time, I'm Tony Frazier, and thank you for watching.